today's show notes. Okay, take me down to Vatican City, where the cardinals are vaping and the turtles are pretty. I don't know. It's Christmas, guys. Cut me some slack here on this intro. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. My name's Al Horner, and all this week on Script Apart, we've been celebrating reaching the end of 2024. Yes, we made it, guys, by chopping it up with the makers of some of the year's biggest and best movies that we didn't cover on release. On Monday, we brought you Denis Villeneuve on Dune Part 2. On Wednesday, the iconic Richard Linklater was here, breaking down his captivating comedy Hitman. Today we're heading off in our proverbial Popemobile to Rome with one of the great adaptation specialists around. He's the BAFTA Award-winning writer of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, The Men Who Stare at Goats, Wolf Hall and many more, and his latest film, directed by Ed Berger, is basically Succession in Church, a pulse-racing thriller about the election of a new pope that's among the most masterfully suspenseful and unpredictable in recent memory. Yes, my guest today, hallowed be his name, is Peter Straughan, writer of Conclave. Conclave tells the story of Cardinal Lawrence, played by Ralph Fiennes, a member of the Catholic Church tasked by the late Pope with overseeing the selection of his successor. Surrounded by powerful religious leaders in the halls of the Vatican, he soon uncovers a trail of deep secrets that could shake the very foundation of the Roman Catholic Church. There are more twists and turns in this film than the ruthless Cardinal Tedesco could shake a vape pen at, and in the spoiler conversation you're about to hear, we get to the bottom of each and every one of them, including the shocking but thematically coherent revelation at Conclave's conclusion. Get ready to discover how Peter's own background as a lapsed Catholic helped his writing process, discover whether or not Donald Trump and Joe Biden served as inspirations at all for certain characters of this warring clergy, and find out what's really happening as bombs explode outside the Vatican's walls, a plot thread left tantalizingly open as we as an audience remain sequestered with these cardinals, never quite seeing the full reality of what's happening. Before we dive into the episode, let me give a quick shout out to our Patreon community as ever, because this show could not go on without those guys in our Patreon community. If you'd like ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, the chance to ask your questions to upcoming guests, and access to our weekly writing hour, then patreon.com/scriptapart is the address for you. It's also probably worth mentioning that if you're looking for a gift for a writer friend this Christmas, you could do a lot worse than gifting a subscription to that Patreon. It really is a fun community of like-minded writers and film fans. We'd love to have you on board. If you want to support the show in a different way, word of mouth is really what helps us get by at Script Apart. Writing a review, talking about us on social media, all that stuff, it really does help us reach new listeners and keep putting interviews like this one today in your feeds every week. As ever, guys, we really appreciate your support. Okay, that's all the admin out the way. I'm going to get straight into it. This is the fantastic Peter Straughan discussing the first draft secrets of one of my favourite films of 2024, Conclave. Thanks again for tuning in, everyone. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, with production as ever by Camille Demecq. I hope you enjoy the show. Peter, so great to meet you. Congratulations on Conclave. I lost myself so completely in this story in ways that I couldn't have predicted going in, and I'm not alone. People have been really responding to this film. Let's begin there. Like, what do you think it is that people are connecting to in Conclave that's driving the reaction the film's been getting? Have you got your theories?
I really, really don't, to be honest, Al. I mean, I love the book. I found the book incredibly gripping and entertaining. It's a way of looking at politics, which I think sort of makes politics feel fresh and maybe clearer in some ways. Um, it's perhaps a way of looking at religion that we haven't seen before. It's a secret world that we go into that we don't usually have access to. All of those things are attractive. Um, to be honest, I think a lot of it is the acting. I think the performances are, universally fantastic. Rafe in particular, I think is, it's certainly one of the career bests, I think, for him. So there's a lot of attractions. I mean, the thing that I'm really, really pleased about is how people are finding it gripping and entertaining. I'm so pleased because that's exactly how I responded to the book. So, the feeling that we managed to transmit that and stay true to that is a good one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you've previously described the process of any sort of handing over of power as kind of inherently dramatic. The quote I have here is, "An election is a gift because it's about as close to the surface of conflict as can be in a scenario where there isn't actually any physical violence." And I think that's really true. Were there any other stories inspiring you, Peter, about a vacuum of power in which, like, the question driving the film becomes who will take the throne? Or, yeah, was the source material perhaps enough?
The source material was enough, to be honest. I mean, Robert Harris, who wrote the book, I think is fascinated by politics, fascinated by power, how it's acquired, how it's held on to, what it can do to the person that has power. I think all of his books, one way or the other, deal with this and they deal with it brilliantly. So no, I mean the inspiration for me was that. I mean I have my own um, preoccupations isn't really the word. I'm aware that I tell a certain kind of story again and again, even with adaptations, even when it's someone else's book that I'm using. I'm aware there are things that I'm drawn to, and I found those within Conclave, and maybe they're slightly different from the things that drew Robert to the story. So I think mine are probably to do with loyalty and betrayal. It seems to be a story that I'm drawn to again and again. So there was certainly that element. But as I say, I think there's something. Well, I mean, as a quote that you read out, there is something about an election which is fantastic for drama. Anyway, because it is naked conflict, which is exactly what you're looking for, obviously. And with the conclave in particular, maybe because it's stripped of so much of the world. If you think of it, if you imagine this having been, say, a documentary, a film about an American presidential election, it's so much more crowded and cluttered in a way, by the world and by the complexity of the process. And conclave is kind of primary colors in a really useful way. I think it's sort of it, it breaks things down to the essential elements of a political election and in a way of the debate about who should be in charge.
Yeah, I want to come back to the politics of it all, but while we're talking about like stories that use this kind of election format, I do want to ask first about the ways that Conclave does that, but maybe offers something different while it does, like something not seen before. Because, I have found that a maybe slightly reductive but fairly useful way of describing the movie to be churchy Succession. So Succession was a show that had like that handing over of power that we discussed, but as an audience we kind of expect the ugliness of that story's characters because they all occupy a world that that ugliness like comes hand in hand with. Like lusting for power is normalized there. These guys will do anything to screw each other over in their quest to come out on top because that is the environment, the kind of cutthroat business world that they exist in. In Conclave, though, we don't expect that at all. Like, we expect cardinals to be morally pure and free of ambition. And yet, as we see, these men are ambitious and that ambition does corrupt. How much was that tension something that kind of intrigued you and kind of pulled you into the story in the first place? Is that one of the things that made you want to come aboard?
Yeah. Robert said he'd seen someone refer to the film as Mean Girls in the Vatican, so which is kind of closer maybe than Succession. Very much. I remember that there's a moment early on in the book. So spoiler, it begins with the previous pope having died, and the main cardinals who the story will be concerned with are gathered there. One's very anxious that they control the story going out because otherwise we'll fall behind in the media cycle. And I remember reading that and thinking, okay, I'm kind of interested in this. And it was exactly what you were saying, Al. It was this unexpected alignment between everything that you associate with the church and with the Vatican and with the Pope and with cardinals, with the spiritual, the otherworldly, the pious, with something very worldly and to do with real world politics, to do with power, to do with media and the control of the media, kind of things you would imagine in a secular election. So there was something about that tension between what these men are supposed to aspire to and what they often are that was really interesting. But but there was something else as well, which I hope is there. I mean, Robert said this. He said that someone described the book as kind. Um, and I sort of find that too, in a way. I mean, that maybe Tedesco, who's the quite right wing cardinal, is the closest to an out and out villain, where it's if you have sort of liberal leanings, it's hard to identify with his views. But with some of the others, you feel like probably they began on the right path and they strayed for various reasons, for various very, very human reasons, for vanity or for greed. In Adeyemi's case, because he had a relationship with a woman when he was younger. So there's a kind of, I hope it's kind of shot through, and I hope, because I think it's important, it's shot through with a kind of forgiveness for the ways that we fail.
So, how much of that positioning of the story was informed by the fact that, from what I've read, Peter, you, like me, grew up with Catholicism and, again, like me, have since drifted from that faith? Was that kind of one foot in, one foot out relationship with the church informing you at all in terms of how you were approaching the script, either consciously or subconsciously?
I do. I really do. I was brought up in a Catholic family, quite a devoutly Catholic family. So I was an altar boy and I went to a Catholic school and we went to mass regularly. And then in my sort of later teens, as many people do, I drifted out. But I didn't have an unhappy experience of the Catholic Church. I mean, obviously, I'm very aware of all the ways we can be critical of the Catholic Church and its past. But personally, I didn't have an unhappy experience of the Catholic Church. So it feels, I have a nostalgia for it, and it kind of feels like home, is one way of thinking of it. So I was, even though it's quite an alien world in the Vatican, I felt quite comfortable in it. But the fact that I sort of know that world and to some extent understand it, but I'm no longer a believer, I think probably keyed in, in the way that I was talking about this, there's a tension throughout the book and throughout the film between the sort of secular and the worldly and the spiritual. And I guess I sort of felt like one of my feet was in the kind of atheistic, non-spiritual world, materialistic world, and one foot was still remembered that a worldview that was rooted in spirituality and religion. So that sort of optical illusion where it's a duck and it's also a rabbit, depending on how you look at it. I kind of think that's what I wanted to kind of make work with the film. That in one way it's a secular story about power and politics, but in another way, from Lawrence's point of view, from Rafe's character's point of view, his worldview is, even though he's struggling with his faith. I mean, one of the great things about writing is that you inhabit other people briefly, and other viewpoints and other worldviews. And so I wanted it to also kind of be seen through his eyes simultaneously, both of those views simultaneously, which I know sounds kind of crazy, but yeah, that was the duck and the rabbit I wanted to try and capture. So one of the things we did, which we kind of added really, was we wanted to think, if you were looking for signs from God, but we didn't want them to be, clearly supernatural. But if you view the world as being shot through with spirituality, so you're kind of on the lookout for messages, or with the little things we could add in that, in Lawrence's point of view, might be seen as signs, messages from on high. And that's the turtle that he finds in the Vatican. That was one of those. I had a different beginning to the film, which we shot, but in the end we decided not to use it in the edit, which was just the very beginning of the film is Lawrence asleep with his back to us. It's nighttime, it's very quiet, and we hold for a long time, and then a window pane just cracks loudly, and it startles him and wakes him up. And then the phone rings to say that the Pope has died. And it was just the window pane cracking, felt like something that could happen without any particular explanation. But it also felt, if you wanted to think that this was all being informed in some way by a divine power. I like these little sort of Easter eggs. So yeah, sorry, that was a long answer, but to be both religious and secular at the same time was the goal.
Let me go back to something you said there that was quite interesting. I also, can't say that I had a negative experience at all of Catholicism, but one thing that kind of struck me about this film is I definitely remember these moments as a kid going to church where obviously, like your priest is presented to you as pious and closer to God and as commanding like a certain amount of reverence as a result. But the more time you spend in church and around these figures, you do kind of see these snatches of them where it's like, oh, they're just a man. There's something earthly about them in contrast to how they're presented to you. And there are so many moments in this movie that reminded me of that feeling, like shots of cardinals vaping and doom scrolling on their phones and doing the things that all of us do. These shots feel so unlike what we normally see on screen, but so true to that revelation that I glimpsed back then of like, these priests are just people at the end of the day. Was that imagery on the page? And if so, how did you arrive at those particular images?
Very much. I mean, that was kind of an in for me, well, for all of us, I think that, again, that tension between our preconceptions and cliches maybe of religious figures. You put them in banal, ordinary settings, or you give them banal, ordinary, everyday things to do. And it's a kind of really interesting effect. I mean, one of the things that was very nice watching Conclave with an audience was laughter, how much laughter we could get. Because we sort of had these little sly sort of images slipped in, like, as you say, cardinals vaping, cardinals going outside to smoke, cardinals having their iPads and iPhones x-rayed, as they come in. And I think it's sort of seeing these, pious, sacred figures doing, as I say, these ordinary, banal things. It sort of gives the audience permission to laugh and to relax and to think, okay, we're not reverential here. We're seeing them as flawed human beings, ordinary human beings.
After watching the film, my urge was to go out and find for myself as best I could the degree to which the behaviour in the movie was rooted in real life. And the best I could find, Peter, was this alleged diary excerpt from one cardinal who supposedly detailed some kind of plot to elect a certain pope that definitely had a certain conclaviness to it, like the machinations of it all. In your conversations with Robert, did you discover the degree to which, like, elections of a new pope, that they do really go down like this with all the kind of like scheming that we see in Conclave?
The only thing I know is that Robert had access to, as you say, the diary of a cardinal. I think it was the Ratzinger election, and I think that was one where there was particularly conflict between the liberal factions of the cardinals and the more right-wing factions, and there was, I think it's the one where it most nakedly became political in the sense of possibly tactical voting and all of the things you think of in a secular election. And I think that was one of the inspiration points for him to think, okay, there's drama here because there is real politics going on here. So in that sense, I think, I think it probably is a truthful reflection. But I suppose also when I read it, I wasn't thinking, oh, we're going to reveal what it's really like to be in a conclave. It was more the other way around, that a conclave was an interesting and clear way to look at what politics is really like. To be honest, look at what we are really like. It felt like it was that way around for me. Yeah.
Well, it would make sense in real life if cardinals really did scheme to influence the outcome of an election like this, because as the movie does a really good job of pointing out, like, there really is so much at stake. The stakes are genuinely high. The political and moral influence of the church on like 1.5 billion people, something like that. Like, having a pope with liberal views on something like abortion, that has a huge knock-on effect for women's healthcare around the world, which, it's easy to forget if you like live in a secular society and aren't plugged into the church, but that is the truth of the matter. How did you go about making those stakes feel so real in the film, Peter, rather than this being like a story about the church and the church alone? Because, I think a lot of people would be surprised by the degree to which, like, the ramifications of the election in this film, they really do kind of weigh heavy on your shoulders as a viewer.
Well, I'm really glad that you feel that way, because obviously one of the challenges that we felt we had was that it's a conclave, and so by definition, those men are locked away from, and women, sorry, there are nuns there as well, are locked away from the world, from the wider world and the wider world's concerns for the period of the election itself. So it becomes a kind of, in some ways, a chamber piece. You know, there are maybe only 8 really main characters who are carrying the story. So the challenge was, to some extent, to constantly bear in mind exactly what you just said, that what these men decide is going to affect the whole world, or an enormous section of the world, quite profoundly. And again, I think that was all the way through. I felt there were these tensions between opposites, these kind of polarities, the spiritual and the secular and the worldly, the grandeur of the Vatican against the frailty of these old men. And the other one was the insularity and the almost parochial quality of the cardinals' lives, with this huge backdrop of the world waiting outside for the result. So we always had that sort of tension in mind. And I guess as well, because there are obvious and I think authentic parallels with secular elections, inevitably you start to connect it with presidential election, or the election, or any secular election. So your mind does connect to the outer world of politics as well.
I suppose at least in regular politics, it's like theoretically just for 4 years that you have to deal with that presidency, versus like, well, till death when it comes to a pope, which again adds to the stakes. You mentioned how secluded the characters in the film are, and it's so effective how insular the film is. The script works so hard to contain, like, we're bedded in with these characters in the conclave. They don't leave, so we as an audience don't leave either. Even the parts of the outside world that we're made to feel aware of, for example, the terrorism subplot that's kind of unfolding on the fringes of the film, we experience it all from inside this little nest.
Yeah.
Why was that important, and what was the impact, do you think, of that choice on the feel of the film, the claustrophobia of Conclave?
I mean, I think that was always the tonal kind of heartland for us, was that you start with the world still open, and then very quickly you shut off from everything, and you go through this process, and the end is this release again from the claustrophobia, the shutters coming up. So in the conclave, those 118 cardinals are literally sequestered. They're locked in. They're not allowed contact with the outside world. They're not supposed to hear any news from the outside world in case it affects their decision. There's something just inherently kind of dramatic about that. And for the elements of this film which are a thriller, essentially, it was incredibly useful. It's like being in a submarine, or it's like being in, those kind of old 30s sort of country houses where the storm blocks the road, and so they're all stuck in the house overnight. The kind of murder mystery, it had that kind of quality where these men are locked in here with their secrets, and who will survive till morning kind of feel. So it was really, really useful for that. And it was a way of, again, it was, we thought about those great political thrillers of the 70s, American political thrillers like All the President's Men, and the way that you could play with those thriller tropes, but in this world that you hadn't seen those tropes used before, felt very interesting. So there's, for example, the scene where 3 of the characters are having kind of secret conversation on the stairwell, and then they hear a noise from below, and they stop talking, freeze, and look over. It says someone been spying on them. They don't trust each other, basically. And it feels, and it's almost a joke at times within the film. One says, I'll be the President Nixon of popes. They're aware of the ways in which this is sort of echoing other political realms. But all of that, I think that was that sort of pressure cooker that they're in, really helped with all of that. And it also meant at the end that when those shutters come up, that alone almost signifies a kind of the end of the story, the transformation, the release. The world can come back again.
Yeah, God, you really do feel that, like the exhale when those shutters come up.
It's really can I just say sorry? It's really interesting. I for a long time the last shot of the film was going to be the new Pope stepping out onto the balcony, and for the first time you'd see the crowds that you'd only heard before, and the camera would sort of go with him and over and into the crowd, and it was almost like you finally got out of the Vatican and into the world. Um, but in the end, we decided there was something sort of nice and disciplined about, you know, you just get to retrace Lawrence's path in. Basically, you know, you saw the shutters coming down, you'll see the shutters going up, and he looks out into the world, and that felt like a kind of more profound way of doing that.
Yeah, because it is Lawrence's story ultimately, and well, we should talk about Lawrence. He's a reluctant hero, and that's an archetype I love, and you do too, by the looks of things. Like it's come up in your work before, Peter. Can you tell me what was so appealing about the idea of Lawrence as someone reluctant to embark on the journey that he ends up going on, and yeah, starting from this point of wavering faith? Like it's really interesting that he has this sense of rejection that he's carrying with him as he begins the process of overseeing this election. What felt so captivating about all those things kind of swirling around this character as the story begins?
I mean, I really liked that character as well. It was Lawrence that made me, you know, there's a homily that Lawrence Solimelius in the book gives. There was another one of the moments when I was reading that made me think, yes, I want to do this. And it's where he says, basically, let us have a pope who doubts, you know, and that certainty is the enemy of unity. Um, and that seemed particularly at this point in history for us in the world, that felt very profound to me and an important message. But as a character, I think, you know, probably like you, I'm drawn to reluctant heroes, anti-heroes almost. I think Robert is as well, Robert Harris is as well, these sort of um, failing, struggling, exhausted, but not quite giving up heroes. I really like. I did a film called Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Le Carre, Le Carre book, and George Smiley, the main character in that, is kind of that type as well, battered and bruised, but won't quite give up. So human, you know, so human, so unheroic in a way, so so flawed and weak, but just holding on long enough. So Lawrence felt like that kind of character to me. I really liked him. I liked his uncertainty. I liked the fact that he was struggling with his faith. I liked uh, that. I like that when it starts, all he wants to do is get this thing over with, and he's absolutely part of the establishment. He's absolutely one of the managers. He's part of the bureaucracy. Get it over with, and the last thing he wants is any drama or scandal. It's like, let's do this as quietly and neatly as possible. And yet he, by the end, is the one who's going to bring everything crashing down. And that's a fantastic journey to send a character on, you know, to go that far, kind of discovering this inner revolutionary, really, within himself. And I think that was the other thing as well. Sorry, I was just going to say, it is, of course, completely possible to make a film that's a critique of the system, the patriarchy, or the Catholic Church, or any of the other sort of, you know, systems from the outside, from someone who's an opponent from the outside. It felt really interesting to do it with the main character who was firmly on the inside.
Let's just go back to something you mentioned there, the importance of having leaders who doubt in this political moment. Can I just ask you to expand upon that, Peter? Is it just that, like, obviously at the moment we have these figures who loom large in our political landscapes who kind of just double down on the positions they have? Like, yeah, what did you mean by that? And what do you think a character like Lawrence represents as someone who is willing to doubt? Why is that useful in our real world?
I suppose because doubt allows us to congregate in the middle ground, and in the middle ground we can meet each other and we can live. And I think increasingly what we find is happening is people are polarizing further and further apart, you know, in the echo chamber of their beliefs and ideas. Certain that they are right and the other person is wrong, certain that they are right and the other person is evil, even, you know. And I think what Lawrence realizes and preaches is, I'm not certain of anything, and therefore I'm much more likely to be able to listen and tolerate your view.
It's interesting hearing you come back to the idea of this film as a political thriller with the church kind of as a stand-in for our political institutions, because, well, obviously the book came out in 2016, so I know the writing of it predated a lot of the parallels that I'm about to mention, but I saw in this film echoes of two prominent real-life political figures. So in Cardinal Tedesco, you have this very bombastic traditionalist with very conservative views, whose popularity seems rooted in like a very loud nature, this almost kind of like make Catholicism great again energy. And then in Cardinal Bellini, you have this figure who projects this sense of humility and this sense of like, well, I have to run because otherwise look who will win. But actually that itself might be kind of a political savvy. He really does seem to want that top seat. He's arguably just putting on a performance of like, only I can do this. That's Joe Biden, or at least that's the perception of Joe Biden, Peter, among a lot of people. Was there anything from our own political reality along those lines that was bleeding into how you were approaching these two characters? As I say, I know the characters were pre-existing before, you know, Trump came into power and Biden was elected in 2020, but maybe there was something that you lent into.
No, to be honest, there wasn't. I mean, it's an interesting coincidence that the film ended up, you know, coming out when it did, in a year that's so focused on politics. I think what's really interesting is in inventing characters that would represent certain aspects of politics, you realize that the real politicians are also kind of, in a way, personas, you know. I mean, Trump is a persona. Trump is a performance. But I think you're right. I think Tedesco is also a performance, you know, the populist leaders. Robert said something really interesting. He said that when he was watching some coverage of the conclave, there was a shot of the cardinals in the background, all the different faces. At the time, he was writing a trilogy of books about Cicero. It was about, you know, the Roman Senate. And he said, I suddenly thought, well, there they all are. You know, there's the pious one, there's the avaricious one, there's the you know, the Machiavellian one. The faces are all still there. This is where they are now. They're in the Vatican. So I suppose, in answer to the question, it's that those types, those political types, are probably eternal, you know, or at least very, very historical, you know, and they re-emerge regularly.
And what was the importance of Sister Agnes in this story, Peter? Because, you know, it's such a male-driven world that the film documents, but it strikes me that, like, the end of this movie, which we'll get to, like, that ending would not lock in the same way without the presence of Sister Agnes in the middle of the movie. Is that fair to say?
Yes. And that's very true. I think that's absolutely true. Again, it seemed interesting to me that we were going to make a film which was, in a way, very much about the patriarchy, about probably the strongest patriarchy on the planet. And those women are there, those women are present, but almost silent in the conclave. There's an order of nuns who, you know, basically do the housework and serve the meals to the cardinals. And the idea that we could just keep showing them, you know, doing the beds in the kitchen, working, we'd keep cutting to them, this sort of silent chorus almost gave them a presence. And there's a kind of tension to their silence as well, because we keep going to them, but they're not allowed to speak. Now there is obviously Sister Agnes, who then has one moment, really, one speech. And somehow that pressure cooker of all that silence gives such an impact to that speech. But yes, it always sort of felt in a way that that's what the film was about. And of course, again, slight spoiler alert, the very end of the film is also about this. I remember there's a bit of graffiti on a wall, I think it was accidental, in Tinker Tailor. And I guess I sort of felt like, in a much more overt way, this is one of the things that the film is addressing, how distorted the world is when, you know, half of the population isn't allowed to speak.
The phrase you just used there of the world's biggest patriarchy, it all goes to kind of underline, as we discussed earlier, the sheer power of this institution. And it strikes me that kind of telling this story, if it was me, there might have been some trepidation about like antagonizing that institution. Like, but from what I understand, the church was nothing but polite to you, despite knowing what this film was, what novel this was you were adapting, and how it depicted the church. Like, they even gave you a VIP tour of the Vatican. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah, I mean, Robert even more so. I think Robert got a kind of real behind. He got the gold standard behind the scenes tour. We got a slightly more bog standard tour, but they were absolutely open to it. I mean, the book had already come out, and as far as I'm aware, didn't get a particularly hostile reception from the Vatican itself. I think. I mean, it wouldn't have stopped us anyway. I mean, you're not going to get sort of Catholic fatwa, um, so it wouldn't necessarily have terrified me. But I wouldn't have done it if I'd thought it was just a hatchet job. It just wouldn't be interesting just to do that. It's an easy target, obviously, but I kind of think you miss the point if you're just going to paint the Catholic Church as pantomime villains, for whatever the things that you may disagree with. So again, it always felt important to me that this was a story being told from the inside with a degree of sympathy for those who are believers and are operating, within the Vatican. As I say, there's a universality to all of the frailty on display, which exceeds the idea that we're just talking about the Catholic Church. We're talking about humans.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. I mentioned the terrorism subplot earlier, Peter. It's something that kind of like is felt rather than explicitly seen at any point in the film. With, of course, one exception, that incredible moment where, like, just as Lawrence puts his vote for himself in the box, all of a sudden there's this explosion, and it feels like divine intervention in some way in that moment. Can you talk to me about, like, that moment, that subplot, and its importance to the greater narrative of the story? Because I think that moment kind of causes so many masks to slip, and that's when characters can start to really say what they really think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it out. I think that the fact that there is this terrorist atrocity causes people to exactly that, lose their masks. And there's a degree of sort of hatefulness is released. And it's when the film hangs in the balance, really, and the election hangs in the balance. Which way will the Cardinals go? Will they react by backing Tedesco, who is right wing and frankly Islamophobic, who sort of wants a holy war, another holy war essentially, or can they resist that and follow the advice of Benitez, who is this sort of slightly unknown newcomer, mysterious newcomer. It's interesting, isn't it? It's that there is a, again, spoiler alert, sorry, but there is a literal explosion, but it's also the moment at which the kind of the system as was is demolished. It's where the cracks sort of appear and can't be sort of brushed over again, really. So it's the crisis moment that forces everyone to make fundamental kind of existential decisions about what they're going to believe in and what they're going to value.
And what about the intersection between what Lawrence is going through in terms of his own personal story and that explosion? Because, it feels very pointed, the fact that the explosion happens right at that particular moment. For a second, like, I thought it was like an interior thing, almost as if like this was his imagination and this was a visual showing of like the explosive feeling of crossing some kind of threshold that he swore he wouldn't cross.
I mean, I think it's another, probably the most important element when we said that we wanted to have a layer of the film that was allowing the possibility of some sort of lines of communication being open between the higher realm and our world. All the way through, Lawrence has denied that he wants to be Pope. And of course, the idea with the votes in Conclave is you're supposed to listen very closely for the Holy Spirit to guide you in your choice and to only vote for those that you genuinely believe in your heart is the person best suited to be Pope. So in the end, kind of driven by desperation in a way, or perhaps succumbing to the seductive thought that maybe I am the person who's meant to be Pope. He votes for himself, and that's the moment when you have this catastrophic. And I think you're right. It's he looks back and thinks that was a judgment. That was a judgment on me and on my choice. I think from Lawrence's point of view, that's exactly how he would consider it.
Well, it leads to that moment where, as I kind of alluded to a second ago, these characters are able to talk freely and they're able to really bring forth their ideologies and their true values, their takes on Catholicism and what the future of the church should be. And they're doing so with like these red garments that they're wearing, these vestments, all covered in white dust and like shattered brick from the explosion. That's one of like many arresting images in this movie. And it's interesting, Ed Berger does such a great job of framing so many shots in the film, almost like the paintings on the walls in the Vatican. Was that on the page, Peter? Were those images something that you had discussed, or did you leave that aspect of the film to him to find?
It is on the page, and to some extent, it's even in the book. You know that there were some injuries, that some people were cut, and I think it probably traces back to an earlier line in the film, quite near the beginning, when Bellini says to Lawrence that the previous pope, it wasn't that he lost faith in God, but he lost faith in the church. And so I think from that moment on, the idea is put that the church itself needs to be broken open, which is, exactly what does literally happen, in order to rebuild it on sort of stronger foundations.
Yeah. Well, we should talk about the end, and I want to give over a good chunk of time to do so because, well, it's one of the most intriguing twists of the year. The first time you read the book, did you anticipate that conclusion, or did it surprise you the way that it surprised me to watch in the film?
It really did. I didn't see it coming either at all. I was really surprised, which is funny because the clues are there. I mean, we did a lot of dialing up and dialing down clues. I think in the end, we probably decided to dial down more than up. But certainly in the book, once you went back, you said, "Oh yeah, this was kind of seeded from the beginning, what Benitez's true situation was." It's the other big moment where I thought, okay, I want to do this because it was so unexpectedly radical. It was so subversive, unexpectedly subversive. Again, this isn't the sort of, this isn't like a young punk novel. It's got such a kind of middle-aged, quiet feel to it, and then it does this really revolutionary thing at the end, this startling revolutionary thing, which, to be fair, I think there's something very Christian about that. Again, this tension between the church becoming increasingly kind of worldly and powerful and materialistic, but I think Robert said this, that the original gospel is the life of Christ. It's that of a revolutionary. So it felt right to me. It felt really right that it had this sort of radical moment in that world.
What were some of the clues then that you had thought about putting in that you eventually took out because, it was going to be making too clear, perhaps, what was about to happen?
There were things like, and I can't remember exactly how we've ended up in the film actually, but it was to do with the ministry of Benitez, which were heavily stacked towards working with women in war zones and female victims of genocide and sexual assault. There was one clue, which I think we filmed, but I don't think we put in the end, which was that they each are given a sort of razor and a toothbrush, a little like a hotel pack. And Lawrence notices that even though we're days into the conclave, Benitez's razor pack hasn't been opened, and he wonders why he noticed that, and then it's kind of forgotten. So it's just sort of little things like that. But I don't know. I didn't really like doing it, to be honest. I didn't like seeding it. But I think because if it works, I don't want it to work as a twist. I don't want it to work as a you didn't see that coming. I'd hate the idea that it's a kind of crying game moment. I wanted it to feel more kind of radical and in a way more profound than that.
And of course, it leaves Lawrence with such a decision to make, whether to keep this secret or whether to favour truth. But, in favouring that truth, he'd be handing over the keys to the highest seat in the church to someone, well, from my perspective, from my politics, someone with quite regressive values. How did you approach all that? Like, how did you approach that dilemma, Peter? Obviously, you had the book to guide you, I know, but what do you think it says about the fact that Lawrence decides to keep Benitez's secret?
I mean, I think in the book, It's literally right at the end. It's like in the last sort of 2 pages or something. And this is one of the areas that I think I went through the most adjustments. The ending was always the area I was most sensitive about. At one point, I did actually try putting the revelation earlier in the film because I was slightly worried about the sense that it's a last minute twist, and last minute twists in films tend to associate with, much more sort of these sort of genre elements. Like you get a last minute twist in a horror film. You don't normally want to get a last minute twist in a kind of political drama, or a religious drama. So it made me a little nervous. I tried to pull it earlier, and it really didn't work. It sort of reduced the significance of the situation. I tried to put it before the final vote so that Lawrence voted in full knowledge of Benita's situation. But I think doing that, I kind of missed the point. The point is, it's radical. He would it be too limited as he is to vote for it? But in a way, when he votes for Benitez, you're supposed to feel, I think Lawrence feels, I know now this is what I'm meant to do. It's like he's heard the Holy Spirit for the first time, and the Holy Spirit says, vote for Benitez. And there's a moment where, because the windows have been blown out, there's a breeze sort of drifts through, and it's almost, like a divine wind. So you're supposed to feel this is right, what he's done is right. And then there's this twist that, well, what God's told you to do is something that you find quite shocking. That feels very Christian to me. That feels like the core idea of Christianity, that it is radical in what it asks you to do, and the leaps it asks you to make. It will not be comfortable. It will take you out of your comfort zone. It will demolish existing systems. So, I think it fundamentally is a Catholic position, actually.
It was wild watching that scene unfold, and the realization kind of dawning on me of what was happening, what was being revealed, because, as we've been alluding to, there is this kind of serendipity with this story in terms of how it's dovetailed with recent elections in the UK and the US. The idea of sex and gender having a certain fluidity, the reality of trans people and non-binary people existing, that's been politicized. It's become like a major tenet of this election cycle on both sides of the Atlantic. Immigration has been another, and that's obviously something that comes up again and again in Conclave. And I'm curious, Peter, do you think this film hits differently for having come out at the time that it has? Because, as I say, it is eerie, the overlap, I suppose.
I mean, I think, yes, it's become even more relevant, sadly, than if we'd made it, 6 years ago, 8 years ago. Things have only become darker and more polarized in all of those areas. I would much rather have a less topical film in a better world, but that's the way it's gone. But I think rather than being a sort of grab bag of, liberal concerns, what I really responded to was the way in which Benitez's situation, and, we should point out Benitez is not trans. Benitez's situation is that he's intersex. So, and what felt so very central about that was, as I was saying earlier, this notion of a world that's polarized between left and right and black and white, and with nothing in the middle. And then there's, as Benitez says, I know what it is to exist between the certainties of the world. So it felt that his situation, as they call it, not only had a kind of a real world impact, but was a beautiful metaphor as well for a world that can be reaching for acceptance and understanding of the whole spectrum of human experience, rather than these, block categories that I think the illiberal world wants to push us into.
Well, I can't wait to go back and watch the film again, knowing the end, because, yeah, so much stuff in retrospect makes total sense with that knowledge. Benitez's insistence upon voting for Lawrence, even against his wishes, because, he's for acknowledging uncertainty, and Benitez as a person falls between the certainties of the world. That is the life, I guess, that Benitez has had to live. Yeah, it's all fascinating. I should begin to wrap this up, Peter. Before I do, though, I did just want to ask about, following up this movie, moving forward with your career, having already adapted so much great work. Like, what are you looking for next in terms of the books that you think you might take to the screen, assuming that adaptation will be what you continue to gravitate towards?
I mean, funny enough, I think the next couple of things I'm going to do are going to be original, since it has been a while. So that feels like a fun challenge. But I mean, I love adapting books, but I never know what was coming next. You know, it's just someone suggests something, you read it, and you connect, or you don't, you respond, or you don't. But you know, I'm really, really lucky, because it is such, you know, with a really great writer and great book, it's such a privilege to be given that job to do, to be able to sort of go into their garden, as it were. You know, I really do love it.
I can imagine. Well, we've run out of time, Peter, unfortunately, but this has been such a delight of a conversation. Thank you so much for this movie. Thank you for your time today. And yeah, I'm looking forward to what you adapt Mean Girls into next. There's lots of other institutions for Mean Girls to unfold in.
Very true. Sadly, that's true. Thank you very much, Ralph.
You've been listening to Script Apart. Thank you so much for tuning in. A reminder that if you want to help the show continue to grow, you can join us on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart or clicking the link in today's show notes. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.